Congratulations, my friends. You have made it to the final chapter of How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myths. And I'm very pleased and excited that we all have made it this far. This particular chapter was a rewrite of an article that I published with New Testament Studies called Literary Eyewitnesses. And I give the bibliographical details in the next slide. As is sometimes the case, scholars write something for a scholarly and academic audience, and then they rewrite or revise it for a popular audience. And this is what I did with this chapter. For those of you wanting to go further, of course, check out this article which I have below. That gives you a little bit more details and more examples of the same kind of phenomena which I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is essentially fictionalized witnesses, witnesses that are brought into a text that actually don't exist or didn't exist in the real world, but they belong to the textual world and they nevertheless are presented in a way such that they confirm and guarantee the truth of what's going on inside the text. And it might surprise people that in the ancient world, this was one of those ancient historiographical tropes that was used more than once. And it's important to understand who used it and when to compare it with what's going on in the Gospels. And specifically in this chapter, I'm looking at the Gospel that is ascribed to John. Now, I can't emphasize enough that the four Gospel writers, of the four, none of them ever claims to be an eyewitness. None of them ever names himself as an eyewitness. None of them ever names an eyewitness to which they are dependent. All of them give up on any claim that they saw or heard anything that Jesus said or did. And this is really important because the culture that these figures belonged to was very big on eyewitness testimony. If you read Josephus, for instance, he's really emphasizing that he saw the events of the Jewish war, and that's the very thing that qualifies him to write those events. Not that he heard from others, or not that he's revising documents, that he gathered in a library somewhere. No, he actually saw the events, and so that is the guarantee of his accuracy. And he proudly names himself, proudly names his role in the war as a general, and as later on, someone in the company of the soon to be Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. So that was a big deal to be an eyewitness. And if you were an eyewitness, you definitely made mention of the fact. That was your pride and joy. That was your badge of honor. And Lucian, in his manual, How to Write History, whether it's tongue in cheek or not, really doesn't matter. He says what all ancient historians believed, that if you can be an eyewitness, be an eyewitness. Go to the place, be involved in the history that you want to write, and then write it. And that's the way that you can confirm to your audience that what you say is truth. None of the gospel writers do this. Absolutely none of them. They are completely hidden and hide themselves. And this really should be the ultimate red flag for people in the Greco-Roman world. And it's really the ultimate red flag today. How can we really trust anything that these writers say? That question perdures today. We're still trying to find their sources. they don't even cite their sources. And the sources that we have indicate that none of them goes back to eyewitness testimony. Because if they had eyewitness testimony, they would have said so. Now, the trope of being an eyewitness goes way back, as far as Homer, and probably even earlier, frankly. But the historiographical trope of naming yourself as an eyewitness and telling about your role in the history itself goes back to Thucydides. And Thucydides set up a model of history. And he said that I'm writing about the things that I saw with my own eyes. And if I didn't see them with my own eyes, I interviewed people who did see them with their own eyes. And I fact checked everything. This is what Thucydides says. And this is really important because Thucydides, like pretty much all ancient historians, they didn't have tape recorders, they didn't have cameras, no video equipment. They didn't even have writing utensils that, allowed them to write quickly. They didn't have automatic ballpoint pens. So what they did was to go see the events or hear a speech and then later on, perhaps much later on, present the gist of what happened. And in some cases, Thucydides says he writes a speech knowing the speech giver and just kind of aiming at plausibility for what this speech writer or this orator rather should have said or would have said given the occasion. And that's perfectly good historiography in the ancient world. And of course, we see this in the speeches of Jesus. Jesus doesn't give long speeches in the earliest gospels. He's not a big talker in Mark, but when you get to John, presumably the latest, my goodness, we have full sermons and monologues. So it's not that the speeches get shorter; they get longer, and it's because of this historiographical trope that you can imagine and inscribe what an author would have said or what you think they would have said given the occasion. But all of that is based, of course, on later reflection. Everything is focalized through the prism of the actual speech writer. So the question logically arises in the case of John, where we have long speeches. We don't know who is remembering them or how they are remembered. But we have this character who is introduced fairly late in the narrative. And this character, unnamed, unknown beforehand, is given tremendous authority as the one who conveys the truth and accuracy about the gospel message, and presumably about all of it, including the speeches since chapter 1. We read in John 19:35 that he who saw this, here referring specifically to the events of the crucifixion, has testified so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, unquote. Well, is that convincing? It may be. Think about this necessity of having an eyewitness. If the gospel writers themselves are not eyewitnesses, they can still have an eyewitness, but they need to have an eyewitness embedded in the narrative itself. Now, usually you would think that this would be one of the named 12 disciples, but in this case, the author of John generates an unnamed disciple and presents him as more intimate with Jesus than the other disciples. So, this beloved disciple, for instance, leans his head on Jesus's breast during the Last Supper. And this beloved disciple is the one who doesn't abandon Jesus when he's arrested. And this beloved disciple is the one who stands at the foot of the cross. And this beloved disciple is the one whom Jesus gives his mother to as effectively, her new son who will take care of her in her old age. So this is an incredibly intimate disciple, much more intimate than Peter ever was, or James or Thaddeus or whoever, of these disciples who weren't even there. This beloved disciple, unnamed, unknown, becomes the guarantor of the accuracy of what we find in John. So, what is another example of this historiographical convention wherein a writer will invent an eyewitness in order to guarantee the historical accuracy of his or her tale? Well, enter Dictys of Crete. If you don't know about Dictys, this is a great opportunity. He is supposedly a Cretan follower of two generals who went to the Trojan War. And Dictys was himself a military man, but he went to Troy specifically to write out an accurate account of the events that happened at Troy. And this is really important. I often harp on the idea that for the Greeks, they all consider the Trojan War to be historical, but they all have this problem that Homer, who wrote about the war, put in all this fantastical stuff about the gods. And even more damningly, Homer wasn't an eyewitness of any of the events in the war. In fact, it seems that he was only living about 400 years after the war. So there was always the question of his sources. Well, with Dictys of Crete, all those problems dissolve because Dictys himself is an eyewitness, and he's directly writing about the war as the war is going on. It's almost as if he's prophetic, that he knows how important the war is going to be, so that he gathers all the writing utensils just so that he can be accurate. And lo and behold, Dictys's long lost history of the Trojan War was found in the year 67 CE, which is late in Nero's reign, not far from the writing probably of the Gospel of Mark. And supposedly, there was ordered a translation of the text because it was supposedly written in an ancient script. And we have a fragment of the Greek translation, supposedly, and we also have the text in full in Latin. And you can go read it for yourself. Now, the problem with Dictys, and really the only problem with Dictys, is that he doesn't exist. He didn't exist. He's a made up character of someone who forged a history of the Trojan War and ascribed it to this essentially fake eyewitness in order to guarantee the accuracy of his tale. And Dictys's tale, Dictys here only in quotes, Dictys's tale was incredibly successful, so that even Christian chronographers and historians 600 years later, people like John Malalas were praising Dictys for his accuracy, when in fact Dictys is just a cover name for a forger who is writing, or rather revising, the history of the Trojan War based on who else? Homer, and a healthy dose of the imagination. And let us not forget that most fascinating of other invented eyewitnesses, Damis. Damis is an interesting character. It is Damas's notebooks that, according to Philostratus, make Philostratus's own life of Apollonius of Tyana accurate and true, and better than his competitors who came before him. These notebooks were, according to the tale, preserved by none other than the empress herself. And it was the empress who gave these notebooks, in the Greek hupamnemata, to Philostratus, asking him to write a biography of Apollonius of Tyana. And that is what Philostratus did. And it is from the notebooks of Damis, then, that Philostratus is able to tell a much fuller tale of Apollonius than had ever yet been told. A much fuller tale of Apollonius's travels to places like Persia and India, and even as far as Ethiopia. And it is based on Damis that Philostratus was able to record these long speeches of Apollonius that hadn't appeared before. And Damis is not just your average disciple. Admittedly, when he presents himself as first meeting Apollonius, Damis appears a bit dense, somewhat like Peter in the Gospels. But as time goes on, Damis clearly shows himself to be much like, or more like, the beloved disciple, a very close, intimate student of the master, Apollonius, privy to all his deeds and words, and with a host of tablets, the preserver of his speeches and his deeds for generations to come. And it is because of this superior source, these tablets, these notebooks, that Philostratus can boast that his biography is more accurate. The only problem is, Damis seems to be an invention of Philostratus himself, or an invention of someone else who was able to dupe Philostratus and apparently, or possibly, even the empress herself. So let's return to the beloved disciple and ask, what is really going on here? Why don't any of the other gospels, whether canonical or non-canonical, ever mention this beloved disciple? Why is he only in one single gospel? Well, my theory is he's an invention and part of a recognized historiographical trope. If you don't have an eyewitness, if you yourself are not an eyewitness, you can still invent one. And what's important about inventing an eyewitness is not only that they can transmit something to you orally, but that they can transfer something to you in writing. And this is exactly how the eyewitness in John is depicted. Quote, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them." So, this beloved disciple who may have died or is no longer available, according to the author of John, something of him survives because his writing survives. And it's his writings that guarantee the accuracy of John's gospel. And that suffices. And that's what makes John's gospel superior to its competitors, including Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Was there ever a beloved disciple? Well, ultimately, scholars will debate this issue. But my money is on the beloved disciple being a historiographical trope. And therefore, all of this effort to identify the beloved disciple as a character in real history, whether it be John, son of Zebedee, or Mary Magdalene, or some other unknown figure, all of this is unnecessary because this is a recognized historiographical trope. And I presume that John's readers would have known that as well, or at least, shall we say, those who read John in terms of the broader literature of Greco Roman historiography. I think that many of the readers of John would, like most readers today, probably have taken the beloved disciple to have been a real historical character. But regardless of one's opinion on that, I think the truth of what we have established here is that there was a historiographical trope in which you could invent an eyewitness to guarantee the truth and accuracy of your story. But that eyewitness is itself, or himself, or herself, part of the story world. So when, for instance, in the letter of First John, the supposed author says that he writes of what he has seen and heard and what his hands have felt, is this really an author telling us that he had touched Jesus, the word of life? Or is this an author who has invented someone who can do that? Someone unnamed. And why unnamed? Well, if you're unnamed, you're unverified. That could be perceived as a disadvantage. But the advantage is that you're also unfalsifiable. An unnamed witness cannot be fact checked. An unnamed witness, we can't call him up. An unnamed witness ultimately is sort of like the voice of God coming from the sky. So there you have it, my friends, chapter 15 of How the Gospels Became History. Here's the full bibliographical information. You can check the description for my author page on Amazon. The only thing that remains now is the conclusion, which I have named the myth of historicity. And it's more of a philosophical analysis of why we think things that happen in the past have a bearing on truth. Thank you to all for sticking with me. If you've learned something, if you've benefited in any way, I hope you'll leave a like and a comment and consider supporting me on Patreon. I want to thank all of you, each and every one of you, for having a listen. I wish you all the best and take care.